start, we're going to have a look at an example. So let's go to Data Miner and have a look. Okay, so here we can see a few temperatures showing. Let's start with the beginning. We have a unit status, so it's quite clear what this is about, and it's indicating that the system is turned on. We can see that this is green. This means that there's an alarming possibility, and currently system on means it's a normal state. We also have this trend graph. You can see it with temperatures as well. This means that we can look back at the history, we could make reports and so on. Now looking at the temperatures, I have 3 different temperatures here: outdoor, room, supply. So it really makes sense when just looking at the description what this is about. It's also quite clear that this is in degrees Celsius, so I'm not really confused. Now the nice thing about this is that it's really showing me what range I have. So when will something go into alarm? You can see with 40 degrees Celsius, it's pretty hot outside, so I will have an indication that this is an alarm. Now this example looks pretty nice, don't you think? In the next example, I would like to show you a bad versus good. So where can we go wrong? Let's have a quick look. I will give you a moment to just have a first look at this. You can really spot some differences already. You can see here quite a large text, but I can't see the description. So I'm not really sure what this is about. While I look at this other example, I can see that this is the system description and it has a bigger text box where it can display that large amount of data. Second component I see here is a system object ID. So it has a lot of numbers, so it doesn't really make sense to me as a human being. And when reading the tooltip, it's actually indicating that this is a more internal component. So I can see what vendor, what module, and so on. So this could be useful internally for my logic, but as a human being to look at it, it might be less useful. So in the second example, it's not displayed anymore. Now let's look at this third component. This really doesn't make sense. So it's a very good example of where we can make the difference in our display. Currently, this is showing a very large number. And when looking at the tooltip, it's actually saying it's the time in hundreds of seconds. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not that quick in recalculating this number into nice days, hours, minutes, seconds. So let's have Data Miner do it for us. So we can nicely display how many days my system has been running. So how do we do these small things? These small fine-tunes, tweaks, make sure that the display is just that little bit better. For this, we're going to have a look in our protocol definition. So we're going to jump to Visual Studio and the Data Miner Integration Studio. So this definition is actually the example we've just seen. For instance, the system description is indicated in my param 1000. The ID here makes it unique internally, so I can reference it in my logic. I would like to do something with the variable with the ID 1000. Same for the name. So this is a more readable internal variable name. Same as you would have in any other programming language, you have a readable name there as well. What's the description? Well, it's what we can see as a human being. So we need to make sure that this really makes sense. It's short, it's accurate, it's just spot on what we want to achieve. So system description really makes sense. Now I have this small item in here. This is the information box. Now this is actually going to be my tooltip. What I'm going to make available as extra information about this param. In this case, this is just a textual description. You can see this could be information we get from a manual or that we rephrase or we really invent ourselves to make sure it's quite useful on how to use this param or what it represents. Now, another component here is that it's of type read. Now, this might be a little bit confusing, so let's go back to our data miner. So we could see here that we have some readable components. I cannot write in this box. This is a read-only component. Same as my system uptime, it's a read-only component. But when I look at system location, I can see a value, but I can also see a writable text box. So I could start typing, sending something to my data source, and it will update my system location. This means I have two components here. Although they are linked together, I have two separate components. I have a read and a write component. Now, let's go back to the definition and maybe already have a look at system location. What we have here is a read component, you can see that, and I have a write component. Now, how are they linked together? We have the name, which is the same, you can see it highlights automatically, and we have the description, that is the same. So due to the name and the description, data miner knows this is a combination. It's a read-write component, so I'm going to add them together or group them together on my display and make sure that one gets linked to another. Now, of course, my internal ID would not be an ID, it needs to be unique, so my ID will be different. Let's go back to the read-only components, the description. There was something special with that one as well. We needed a bigger box. So we needed to display some extra lines in there, make sure that it's nice and readable. So I'm going to jump from my read type to this last component to already indicate you how I can make this bigger on my screen. Measurement is actually, it's quickly to remember, it's actually what we can see, how we're going to represent it on our screen. I'm going to show it as text, so as a string, as textual format, but I'm going to add some extra lines. By default, you always get one line. And that's what we could see. Let's switch back to data miner. We can see this, for instance, in this bad example, we just have one line. What we would like to achieve is just add a few more lines so it's nice and easy to read this information. So that's what we're doing in the measurement. Measurement is how am I going to represent it? I'm going to represent it as text. It really is text. And I'm going to add some extra lines so it makes it a bigger box. Now, as you can see, I skipped a few components. Now, what are the other components? Might be useful to know as well. First part is how data miner should interpret it internally. So it could be I'm displaying something as a number, for instance. I'm going to use it on display as a number, but internally it's actually text. Could be that my data source is returning text, so I'm going to make it as a textual format internally for data miner to use, but I'm going to convert it to a number on my display. Another example could be that internally it's a number, and in display I would like to make sure that my number links to something more readable. So I could, for instance, make a list. That's what we have with the system unit on. We had system on, we could have a 1, for instance, as a value that we return from a data source, but I'm going to translate it on screen as something else. So internally, this could be a number, but on display, I'm going to translate that number to a specific value. Don't yet worry how we do these things, it's just to make sure that you understand this little section. So it's internally, data miner is going to use a specific value as text or number or whatever. Now we have a little different component here, it's SNMP. Now we're going to look at this a little later, but this is basically whenever we're using SNMP communication, I would like to retrieve a specific value, I need to indicate where to retrieve it from. And that's where I'm going to use this SNMP indication. But let's keep it aside for now. The most important part we still have is the display. So you can say, yeah, but you mentioned measurement is how am I going to display? Yes, but you still need to display it somewhere. You need to make it available so my client, whenever I'm browsing or I'm using Cube to connect to my data miner, it needs to get that information, and I need to have a page displayed it somewhere. So what's in this display? Arte display actually means make it available. Make sure it's there. So my client, your browser or data miner cube, can have a look at it. But it's not just the client side. It could be another module in data miner that needs that information as well. Imagine I have an automation script and I need to get the information, I need to set the information in my element, so it's going to use this protocol as well. That means that I need to put Arte display to true. Even though it's not on a page anywhere, it needs to have Arte display true, so it's available outside of my protocol. How do I make it available on a page? We'll just jump to this position. Where am I going to locate it? I'm going to locate it somewhere. Now on location, I can easily use the display editor in DIS. This means I can just select my params, I can drag and drop them, I can move them around, make sure it has a nice organized view. And not like I'm currently doing. But this makes it quite easy to update and create this position information in here. Now what's the range? Now in this case, my manual indicated I only have a maximum amount of characters I can give to my system description, so I can limit it. So even when it's a text, I can add a range in there, say, well, this is the amount of characters you can enter. For numbers, it's very similar. Remember the temperatures you had, you could give a temperature range from 0 to 40, for instance. And this would be my maximum used on my display. It's in the display. This means internally, it's not limited. I could have logic to set 100 in my, for instance, my logic in my protocol. I'm going to force it to an incorrect number. That's still possible. That's internally. On display, as soon as it goes to a different process, it will look at to this range. Now this is a readable component. We already spoke a little bit about a writable component, but let's look at it a little bit deeper. Let's jump to the location. What we have here is again an ID, a name, description. As mentioned before, the name and description will be items that link the read and the write component together. The type read, type write on the other side, we have internally, it will define it or use it as a text. Of course, for your write, it's the same. You can even see that it's quite literally a copy-paste of my readable components, just the write that is different. Even when I'm looking at my position, you will see in this case, it's the same. Why am I saying in this case? I could put my read component, so a read-only component in, let's say, a overview page. And the write component, alongside with the read, of course, will be added in a configuration page. So it is possible to split things up, and that's why we have here positions, and I can add some extra position. Why don't we do that right away? So I can see that I currently have just one page. Let's add a new page. Let's call it config. Can add it, so you can see that there's an indication here. Why? Well, there's no variable in here. There aren't any params indicated in here. That means I would have an empty page. Now data miner cube will remove it from the list, but still we have a definition that doesn't do anything. Now, what was the purpose? I wanted to make sure that the location was read-only on my system page, and in my config I could configure it. This means I would still add my read. I can drag my write as well, but I can add my read and my write. You can see that it's combining this as well in DIS. Why? Because the name and description are the same. So I'm going to add the read write here. Why read as well? Well, I would only have one write box otherwise, so I don't know what I'm setting. So it would be useful to have the read value, the component, the value itself in here as well. Now, I still need to change something in my system. I'm going to remove that write from my location in my system info. Config, read write, system info, just read. Let's apply this and see what's happened in here. So I have position, I have a system info page here on my read component, but I also have a page config. When I look into my right, the only thing I have here is config. Now what's the result? It's 2 pages, 1 read component on my system info and a read write on my config. Now let's have a look how it looks like in Data Miner as soon as I publish this. So in DIS we have a nice button, publish, that will link to our Data Miner. And we can have a look how it looks like. It's restarting. Okay, so what I have here is a system location. You can see that my writable box is gone. Why? Well, I made only the read component available. And when I go and look, I have a second page here, config, where I have my writable box again. I can write something in there. Okay. So you can see with DIS, it's very easy to use the editor to adapt your style a little bit. Now there's one extra thing I wanted to show you, and that's that time indication. So I told you we can easily translate the number that we had into a nice readable time. Now let's go to our time variable, system uptime we have here. So what we had internally in the documentation said it's hundreds of seconds. That means I can make a calculation. Why? Because the option that I have here, it's feature time. It's going to use the data in seconds and then translate it nicely to days, hours. Even if it would be years, it would show you years. So for this, I need to make a small calculation. So it's actually 2 items I'm going to show you at once. We have a measurement displayed as a time indication, and on the other side, it's a very small calculation. Whenever we need to make small calculations, we need to make a sum. In this case, we're going to divide. We can use this sequence. So on whatever we retrieve, I'm going to make or apply a small calculation, and that's the value I'm going to display. So I don't need a lot of logic. I don't need quick actions, for instance. I don't need extra stuff. I can do this right away in my pattern. So internal information, I'm going to make a calculation on, make sure it's available, and on my measurement, I'm going to apply, in this case, a nice time indication.